All right, this lecture is about the ANS, also known as the Autonomic Nervous System. Autonomic does not mean automatic. Autonomic means it's autonomous from conscious thought. This is the part of the nervous system that takes care of all the functions you don't think about on a daily basis, everything from your heart rate to how fast you digest your food, blood pressure, and a lot of other small things such as gland secreting hormones, and all the various other things that we don't think about, like respiratory tubes. So we've actually looked at this a little bit. We're taking different pieces that we've done all along and we're putting it together now. So this isn't all new. We've called it so far VE. Visceral efferent is the autonomic nervous system. We mapped VE, so we're going to look at that. We've talked about the cranial nerves, and I mentioned the vagus being parasympathetic. So we've talked about pieces of this system. We're now going to bring it all together. And there's two branches to the autonomic nervous system. We have the sympathetic branch, which physiologically or common use characterizes as the fight or flight system. These are all the reactions that help you survive when you're in danger. You have to decide if you're going to fight off the danger or if you're going to run from the danger. And then we have the parasympathetic, which has been characterized as the rest and digest system. We think of this as the maintenance system. This is the part of the nervous system that takes care of all the repairs, resting the heart, increasing digestion, absorbing food, and making sure we make the best use of it. So let's start with sympathetic, fight or flight. We also call this the thoracolumbar, and that's because the origin of the first multipolar neuron is the thoracic or lumbar spine. Remember, all those nerves that we mapped, we have the first multipolar neuron, and then we went into the paravertebral ganglion, and then we had a second neuron. Well, that first one came in the spinal cord. And we didn't say so at the time, but it was all thoracic or lumbar spinal cord. And all of the VE we did as part of that mapping were sympathetic. We need either the paravertebral ganglion, which we mapped, we saw, we know what the paravertebral ganglion is and the existent chains, or something called the prevertebral ganglion. And that's, instead of being next to it sideways laterally, we just move that ganglion to the anterior. And those are mostly for digestion. So we have pre and paravertebral ganglia. They're both sympathetic. My neurotransmitter that I'm going to use, what does the cell at the end in the organ, what we call the postganglionic neuron? Because we had two cells, the second cell is called the postganglionic neuron, and we look at it as being adrenaline, noradrenaline. It also gets called epinephrine or norepinephrine. You're probably familiar with adrenaline. But those two names, adrenaline and epinephrine, mean the same thing. So we talk about an adrenaline rush and an EpiPen. It's the same chemical. And the receptor is called an adrenergic receptor. So remember this drawing, the one that you fear and dread? Don't worry, we're not going to map any more neurons, but I want to remind you of what you already know. So we had this first neuron that was in the spinal cord. It was a multipolar neuron. It was short. It went into the ventral root and it went into this paravertebral ganglion, at which point it met up with a second cell, also multipolar, that went out through the ventral ramus. So the first cell is called the preganglionic neuron, meaning the cell before the ganglion. And the second cell is called the postganglionic neuron, the cell that comes out of the organ. And this is the cell, or comes out of the ganglion and it goes to the organ. So this is paravertebral. Prevertebral would just be anterior. So we said that the neurotransmitter is adrenaline, also known as epinephrine. What responses do we get? Well, we see that the response is based on where we are, not this system. So we might have different reactions to the same exact neurotransmitter in different parts of the body. For example, when we have sympathetic adrenaline, the heart rate increases, the force increases, but digestion decreases. Same neurotransmitter, different locations, different responses. In the respiratory tubes, we see that the tubes dilate, which is actually an inhibition. not breathing. It doesn't change breathing itself. Breathing is skeletal muscle. We're talking about the respiratory tubes. So they open up, the pupils dilate when you're scared. If you've ever watched a cat hunting, you've watched the pupils dilate. But arteries, it depends on where we are. Some increase, some decrease. But let's think about this respiratory tube thing for a moment. If you know anybody who has asthma and they have a rescue inhaler, that rescue inhaler is probably albuterol. Albuterol mimics the sympathetic system, and so it causes the tubes to dilate, which is why it rescues from the asthma, which is constricting the tubes. But one of the big side effects of albuterol is the heart rate increases. People will actually notice this. So we have to think about what is in the medication, where it works, and what the side effects are. So this is the sympathetic system. The parasympathetic system, which I called rest and digest, is now called craniosacral. Sympathetic was thoracolumbar. Parasympathetic is craniosacral. And that's because the cells originate as cranial nerves. We had 3, we had 7, we had 9, and we had 10 that all have parasympathetic. We also have some that come from your sacral spine, not that many. We're not mapping them because all of the ganglia are in the organs. The ganglia are frequently named for the organ. So in the eye, you've got something called the ciliary ganglia for cranial nerve 3. So we're not going to look at the specific ganglia. We just know that they have a ganglia. The difference is, instead of being short, this time the preganglionic neuron is really long. Think about cranial nerve 12 or 10. Sorry, not 12, 10. It starts on your brainstem and it goes all the way down into your digestive system, really long. It connects there in a ganglion in your digestive system to a very short postganglionic neuron. This time, my neurotransmitter is called acetylcholine, which we abbreviate as ACH, which is recognized as the abbreviation for acetylcholine. And we see that this is released in the organ, much the way the sympathetic releases adrenaline. This time, my receptor is called a muscarinic receptor. Acetylcholine has 2 different types of receptors. The one for parasympathetic is called the muscarinic receptor. Now, keep in mind, all of the neurotransmitters and receptors I'm talking about are in the organ. If you looked up something about the ganglia, it would be totally different. We're not doing the ganglia itself. We're doing the postganglionic. So I mentioned here, again, that it is cranial nerves 3, 7, 9. And I gave the specific locations, but I put that red star next to the vagus again, just like I did in the cranial nerve lecture, because it is the parasympathetic VE to all of the thoracic cavity and most of the abdominal cavity. And we say it ends at this left colic flexure. So here again, I'm emphasizing the vagus nerve being this parasympathetic VE to all of this space. What are my reactions? So we're the opposite of sympathetic. Not every system that gets sympathetic gets parasympathetic. There's some that don't. For instance, the heart rate is the opposite of sympathetic. The heart rate decreases when you have parasympathetic stimulation, but digestion increases. So there's the opposites. The pupil constricts, which is an opposite. And we see that the respiratory tubes have no reaction. Parasympathetic doesn't go to the respiratory tubes. They will constrict on their own without stimulation. What we need is the ability to open them up. So this is the autonomic nervous system. Now, we've got this board in the lab that is the autonomic nervous system. If you look at this board, the white nerves represent the parasympathetic. And the one I emphasized here was, guess what? Cranial nerve, number 10, the vagus nerve. So you'll see it has the red star, and it's the one that has the arrow. Then the yellow nerves represent the sympathetic nerves, and you'll see you have this paravertebral chain of ganglia alongside the vertebra. Here, anterior to the vertebra, are those few prevertebral that I mentioned up above that go to the digestive system specifically. Now, a lot of times people say, how would you ask a question? I would ask you to identify cranial nerve number 10, the vagus nerve. What is this nerve would be my question. What is this structure? It is the paravertebral chain of ganglia. But I also might ask, how does the parasympathetic reach the organ tagged A, in this case at the arrow? And you would tell me, oh, that's the small intestine. Therefore, it gets parasympathetic from cranial nerve number 10, the vagus. If I said that for the heart or the stomach, the answer is the same. If I asked you how sympathetic gets there, you would say it comes from the paravertebral chain of ganglia. It's just knowing which goes with which system. Vagus nerve, parasympathetic. Paravertebral chain of ganglia, sympathetic. And that is the end of the autonomic nervous system.